Why the world is losing respect for Canada. Have you noticed how Canada's global image has shifted dramatically in recent years? Once regarded as a symbol of kindness, fairness, and peace, the country now finds itself entangled in controversies, criticism, and even ridicule on the international stage. Once the friendly neighbor on the world map, Canada now faces skepticism even from its traditional allies. But what has led this once praised ideal nation to such a predicament? In reality, Canada's standing has never been more tested than it is today. Issues such as contentious immigration policies, diplomacy missteps, and internal struggles over Indigenous rights are undermining the image Canada has carefully cultivated. Additionally, disputes with global powers like China and India have placed Canada in a precarious position, transforming a once neutral country into a subject of criticism in international relations. This begs the question, is this decline in respect for Canada a temporary phenomenon, or does it signal a deeper, more systemic issue? Looking back, while Canadians may continue their daily lives unaware, their country's reputation is rapidly shifting on the global stage. Decisions, policies, and even seemingly minor scandals are contributing to a changing perception of Canada worldwide. Can the country reclaim the trust and admiration it once commanded, or is that a dream of the past? The answer might be more thought-provoking than you expect. In today's discussion, we'll explore some surprising reasons why the world may be losing respect for Canada. Trust me, by the end, you might see the country in an entirely different light. Reason 1. The myth of Canada's innocence. For decades, Canada has been synonymous with kindness, peace, and neutrality in international affairs. The country has been celebrated as the good guy in global narratives, where human rights are protected, diplomacy is prioritized, and multiculturalism is cherished. However, in recent years, this myth of Canadian innocence has started to crack, forcing the world to re-evaluate its once pristine image with a more critical lens. In the 20th century, Canada was a leader in global peacekeeping efforts. Canadian soldiers were celebrated for their bravery and humanity in protecting civilians in conflict zones. But today, that legacy feels more like a romanticized story than an ongoing reality. For example, Canada's role in conflicts such as Afghanistan has raised questions. Is this truly a peace-loving nation, or just another player in the global political system? In 2001, Canada joined the US and NATO in the controversial invasion of Afghanistan, stepping away from its neutral image to actively participate in a divisive war. Reports of civilian casualties, destroyed infrastructure, and prolonged instability in the region have drawn harsh criticism of Canada's involvement. Similarly, the sale of arms to nations like Saudi Arabia, where human rights violations are rampant and involvement in Yemen's conflict persists, has further tarnished Canada's reputation as a country that does the right thing. Canada's failure in global diplomacy is another troubling sign. In 2020, the country lost its bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, a symbolic blow to its international influence. Facing competition from smaller, less controversial nations like Norway and Ireland, Canada was passed over, a stark reminder of its declining diplomatic appeal. This reality has left many questioning whether Canada remains the ideal model it once was. While Canadian leaders often emphasize commitments to human rights and peace, the reality is that strategic decisions are increasingly driven by economic and military interests. This not only damages the country's global reputation, but also creates division within Canadian society, where citizens once took pride in their nation's standing on the world stage. As the world begins to notice the disconnect between Canada's rhetoric and actions, the country faces a profound question. Will it return to its roots as a peacekeeper and neutral mediator, or will it pursue a new, less idealistic but more pragmatic role on the geopolitical stage? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear. The myth of Canada's innocence has been challenged, and restoring its reputation won't be an easy task. Reason 2. Human rights issues and Indigenous peoples. Canada has long prided itself as a global symbol of human rights, fairness, and social justice. However, this image is becoming increasingly tarnished as the world pays closer attention to the country's treatment of Indigenous peoples, a deep and indelible stain on Canada's human rights record. For decades, Indigenous communities in Canada have faced severe and persistent challenges, from poverty, inadequate healthcare, substandard housing, to limited education. These injustices are not only present, but have been systemically entrenched over generations. Successive governments have made promises to improve these conditions, but in practice, little substantial progress has been achieved. One of the most troubling issues is the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The alarming number of Indigenous women who go missing or are murdered each year has gone largely unaddressed for far too long. Although the Canadian government launched a national inquiry in 2019 to acknowledge the scale of this issue, many activists argue that the inquiry has not resulted in meaningful change. This problem has drawn international scrutiny, with organizations like the United Nations and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination criticizing Canada for its human rights violations against Indigenous peoples. In 2019, the UN issued a scathing report calling for Canada to take stronger action to rectify these injustices. The stark contrast between Canada's advocacy for human rights on the global stage and its domestic record has led many to view the country as a symbol of hypocrisy. Beyond social issues, conflicts over land rights and economic development have further exacerbated tensions between the government and Indigenous communities. Projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion have faced fierce opposition from Indigenous groups who argue that these developments violate land rights and harm the environment. While the Canadian government insists these projects are vital for the economy, Indigenous communities denounce them as clear examples of disregarding their rights and voices. These tensions have led to widespread protests, garnering international media attention and raising questions about whether Canada truly lives up to the human rights image it claims to uphold. Canada is now at a critical crossroads. To preserve its international reputation and rebuild trust with its own people, especially Indigenous communities, the country must take decisive action. Balancing economic development with the protection of Indigenous rights is not only a moral responsibility, but also crucial for the nation's future on the global stage. Failure to address these issues will erode Canada's global credibility and overshadow its once proud human rights legacy. Reason 3. Environmental double standards. Canada has been celebrated as a pioneer in environmental stewardship. With its vast natural landscapes, abundant resources, and commitment to international climate agreements, Canada has crafted an admirable image of environmental responsibility. However, in recent years, this reputation has been overshadowed by contradictions between public commitments and actual policy. The development and extraction of Alberta's oil sands are perhaps the clearest examples of Canada's environmental double standards. Oil sands extraction not only devastates natural landscapes, but is also one of the largest sources of carbon emissions in the world. This raises a glaring question. How can a country claim to be an environmental leader while championing an industry that is so harmful to the planet? The environmental consequences of oil sands projects are severe, including deforestation, water pollution, and significant greenhouse gas emissions. Despite strong opposition from environmental activists, Indigenous communities, and even international voices, the Canadian government continues to defend these projects, arguing they are essential for the economy. Indigenous communities, often directly affected by these oil sands projects, have been vocal in their resistance. They argue that the government is violating land rights and damaging ecosystems while calling for a transition to sustainable renewable energy sources. Yet their voices are frequently drowned out by economic priorities and the interests of energy corporations. The discrepancy between Canada's international commitments and its fossil fuel reliance has also tarnished its global standing. Despite being a signatory to the Paris Agreement and pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, Canada's continued expansion of oil and gas extraction undermines these efforts. International critics argue that Canada seems more focused on protecting its traditional energy sector than taking meaningful steps to address the global climate crisis. Pressure from other nations, particularly those in Europe, making significant strides in reducing carbon emissions, further complicates Canada's position. While these countries transition to clean energy, Canada's dependence on fossil fuels diminishes its credibility as a climate leader. To maintain its reputation and global role, Canada must adopt a clearer and more balanced strategy between economic development and environmental protection. Without this shift, the country risks not only losing international trust, but also facing growing domestic dissatisfaction, as citizens increasingly demand a sustainable future. The contradictions in current policies not only weaken Canada's climate change efforts, but also tarnish its once proud image as a model of environmental responsibility. Reason 4. Political leadership and scandals. Canada, once celebrated for its stable democracy, political transparency, and progressive values, is now grappling with serious challenges to public trust in its leadership. Criticism is coming not only from international observers, but also from Canadians themselves, who increasingly express disappointment in political decisions, leadership styles, and scandals that have shaken the moral foundation of the country. One of the most notable political scandals was the SNC-Lavalin affair in 2019, which tarnished the image of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government. This controversy involved allegations that Trudeau and his associates interfered with the judicial system to benefit SNC-Lavalin, a major engineering firm accused of bribery and corruption in Libya. Both domestic and international observers criticized this as a lack of transparency and a violation of the rule of law. Despite Trudeau's efforts to defuse the situation, the scandal left a significant stain on his political career and eroded public confidence in the integrity of Canada's political system. Adding to this was the WE Charity controversy, which further fueled criticism of Trudeau. The government's decision to award a multi-million-dollar contract to the WE Charity, an organization with close ties to the Trudeau family, sparked accusations of favoritism and conflicts of interest. These controversies raised questions about whether the government's decisions truly served public interest or were influenced by personal and political relationships. The fallout from these scandals has not only damaged Trudeau's reputation, but also undermined Canadians' trust in their political system. Many citizens feel disillusioned, perceiving national leaders as prioritizing political allies and personal networks over the public good. This discontent has manifested in protests, public debates, and a growing sense of disconnection from democratic institutions. Canada's international image has also taken a hit. Once a beacon of transparency and integrity, the country is now facing criticism for a political system that seems less reliable than it once was. The succession of scandals has led many to question whether Canada can still be regarded as a model of stable democracy. To regain trust, Canada must not only address the issues at hand, but also commit to stronger principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity in politics. Without such changes, similar scandals will continue to erode the nation's image, both domestically and internationally. Reason 5. Domestic polarization and instability. The challenges facing Canada are not limited to individual leaders or political parties. A broader sense of disorder and disconnect between the political system and the real needs of Canadians is becoming increasingly evident. Political polarization in Canada has grown significantly in recent years. Major parties like the Liberals and Conservatives appear more focused on partisan battles than addressing critical issues. Politics has become a power struggle rather than a collaborative process aimed at achieving the the common good. Constant bickering and legislative gridlocks have stalled progress in essential areas such as climate change, indigenous rights, and healthcare reform, further fueling public frustration. The result is a growing distrust in the political system. Canadians feel that their leaders no longer represent them effectively and that the political elite is increasingly disconnected, more concerned with maintaining power than resolving national challenges. On the international stage, this polarization also affects Canada's reputation. Countries that once admired Canada's ability to mediate and resolve conflicts now question whether the country can maintain its leadership role. Slow and indecisive responses to major global issues, ranging from humanitarian crises to climate change, have made Canada appear less capable and influential in the international community. This erosion of trust reflects not just short-term issues, but systemic challenges. Without fundamental changes in its political approach, Canada will continue to face domestic instability and a decline in its international standing. To regain respect from both its citizens and the global community, Canada needs leaders who are not only competent and ethical, but also willing to transcend polarization and address the significant challenges facing the country. Timely and decisive action is essential, not only to restore trust, but also to reshape Canada's image as a reliable, united, and positively influential nation on the world stage. Reason 6. The shift in global power dynamics. The way the world perceives Canada has undergone profound changes as global power dynamics shift. In a world increasingly shaped by emerging powers and geopolitical transformations, Canada is struggling to maintain its role and influence on the international stage. One of the key factors affecting Canada's standing is its relationship with the United States, its most important economic and political partner. Recent U.S. administrations have focused more on domestic issues, deprioritizing international diplomacy. This shift has left Canada, which traditionally aligns its foreign policy closely with the U.S., adrift in a rapidly evolving global order. Meanwhile, rising powers such as China, India, and the European Union are reshaping the global power structure. With a relatively small population and economy, Canada struggles to maintain prominence. A striking example is the diplomatic crisis with China over the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at the request of the US. This incident not only complicated Canada's relationship with China, but also exposed the country's limitations in navigating sensitive international disputes. China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, for over 1,000 days in what the international community condemned as hostage diplomacy. This event highlighted Canada's vulnerability when dealing with a rising superpower and raised questions about its ability to protect its interests and citizens on the global stage. Similarly, Canada's efforts to counter Russia, particularly in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, have been overshadowed by more influential powers. Russia's bold foreign policy moves continue to assert its dominance, rendering Canada's contributions less visible and impactful in the eyes of the international community. India's rise as a global power further complicates Canada's position. With its vast population and rapidly growing economy, India is asserting itself as a major player on the world stage. In contrast, Canada's traditional role as a neutral mediator appears increasingly irrelevant in a global arena dominated by intense competition among superpowers. Without a clear and adaptive strategy to address these shifts, Canada risks becoming sidelined on the international stage. This would not only diminish its global influence, but also erode the pride and confidence Canadians have in their country's leadership. Conclusion: Canada's global image is at a critical crossroads. Once celebrated for its neutrality, commitment to human rights, and environmental leadership, the nation now faces skepticism and criticism, both domestically and internationally. Challenges such as its treatment of Indigenous peoples, environmental double standards, political scandals, and the shifting global power balance are dimming the country's once bright reputation. To restore its standing and trust, Canada must confront uncomfortable truths, pursue meaningful reforms, and craft a strategy that balances economic development, environmental sustainability, and international leadership. Failing to do so risks not only losing its global stature, but also weakening the cohesion and faith of its citizens. The most pressing question now is whether Canada has the determination and vision to overcome these challenges, or whether the ideals that once made the country a global icon will continue to fade into obscurity.